Okay, everyone, so I think we're going to get started. Before I start, just let me say in justification of myself, one of the burdens of age is that the effects of jet lag get worse. So if at some point in the session you see me slumped in my chair, it's not because I'm not engaged or I've eaten too much lunch, it's because I've barely any sleep since Saturday. That said, welcome everyone to this session on learning from failure in philanthropy and social innovation, co-organized by AVPN and Alliance Magazine. Many thanks to AVPN for putting in the work and hosting us here in Bali. Welcome to all of us here in the auditorium, and welcome to all those watching on live stream. My name is Andrew Milner. I'm a freelance writer and features editor of Alliance. And this is a good time to say that some of you, lucky enough to be near the front, may be sitting on one of these, which is the latest edition of Alliance. And the special feature of this edition, not coincidentally, is learning from failure in philanthropy. So if you want to get different perspectives on what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, there's 20-odd pages of exciting, interesting stories, which will discuss some of the issues we're about to raise. I've got a wonderful panel to help me do that. I'm talking them up because I'm hoping they're going to do most of the work. Before I bring them in, let me just say a few words to sort of frame the session and tell you what to expect. We're going to be running for 90 minutes. I'm going to ask each of the panelists in a minute to make a short presentation, say who they are, what they do, and then say how the concept of failure or learning from failure relates to their work. I should also draw your attention to the app. If you want to join in the audience, ask questions, please use the app. There's a question function on there, so just type in your question, and by the magic of technology, we will see them on these monitors that we have on the stage here. Okay, I think that about covers it. So, let the revels begin. Learning from failure in philanthropy and social investment. I'm going to start with a quote here. If you haven't failed, you're not trying hard enough. Seems like a no-brainer. Learning from failure contributes to high-quality implementation, strategic innovation, and improved governance and transparency. Despite the fact that all funders more or less admit this, it's a principle that doesn't often translate into practice. Many foundations, the staff, boards, and donors of all stripes still find it difficult to have conversations about failure. There's some very obvious reasons for this, one of which is that we're all human beings. We hate to admit that we're wrong. It's a loaded term, isn't it? It brings with it feeling of embarrassment, shame, even guilt. What's more, failure is not always easy to identify and can be a matter of perspective. What seems like success to a funder may not be perceived as such by a beneficiary, and I think we're going to talk about that in a little while. But that's only one part of the problem. Even when you own and acknowledge failure, there's still the question what to do about it. I've got to quote Amy Edmondson here, who notes in an article in the Harvard Business Review as follows: learning from organizational failures is anything but straightforward. Organizations need new and better ways to go beyond lessons that are superficial or self-serving. That means jettisoning old cultural beliefs and stereotypical notions of success. Mark the word culture. She's writing about business, of course, but it's just as applicable, if not more so, to the non-profit sector. So, at this point, I'd like to bring in my other panelists. I'd like to ask them first to say a couple of words about who they are, what they do, and how the notion of failure plays into their work. So our first one, and I feel very humbled to be among such august company, is Dr. Akhil Shahani. Dr. Shahani is Managing Director of the Shahani Group. He runs a franchised range of colleges in areas like business, media, real estate, and finance, which incorporate global, industry-oriented education systems that make their graduates employable. He also runs the EdTech platform Ask.Careers and recruitment firm Ask Talent Services, and serves as the chairman of Global Discovery Schools, which are a franchised chain of 14 innovative schools. His work in the non-profit space is also extensive. He's on the advisory board of Unlimited India and Ido Bro, two incubators which support social enterprises. He's also the director of the Sage Foundation and trustee of the Shahani Trust, both of which have a range of charitable initiatives in education. He's also been listed as one of the top 50 thought leaders in higher education. So, on that note, Akhil, over to you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm learning from the failure of this mic. So, all right. So actually, our panelists were discussing earlier is that what would be considered failure and success in this panel, and we said the measure would be the number of people who are looking at us at the stage versus looking at their smartphones. So, thank you for your help. All right. So, what wasn't mentioned in the PR blurb that came in there, my profile, I'm a third-generation Asian family foundation owner, right? And what I'm going to talk about is be a little more philosophical because it's post-lunch, so therefore we need to start with a lighter subject. Talk about what's the nature of failure, especially when it comes to multi-generational family offices or family foundation. Who decides failure? Who decides success? What are the parameters of that? And I'm going to talk about that based on the experiences of my family. Now I'm going to, as being ever optimistic, I'm hoping that the clicker works. Hang on. Yes, it does. All right. The Shani Trust, 70 years of learning, because of course, we as educationists, we don't believe in failure. We just believe that you repeat the class and you learn and then fast, finally. So let's talk about the first generation. The background is that, so my family is from the state of Sindh, which is a state which is now part of Pakistan. And some of you guys know about India's partition, where a lot of the Sindhis had to come down to India and migrate. Now, when you look at the story of partition in India, most of the time you look at all these old Indian historical movies where there are a lot of these dirt poor farmers going on the desert, and there are other communities trying to kill them, and they're all like dying, and it's all really crying. The Sindhis actually had a slightly better time. So my great-grandfather was actually very large in the education sector in Pakistan, Karachi. And my grandfather was into the education textbooks business. So, of course, being Sindhis, we had advanced knowledge, so therefore we knew in advance that we're going to be kicked out of that country. So he sent all his assets down to Bombay, and he came by plane. Our partition experience. So, but what happened is that when he set up in 1947 in Bombay, he said, look, I am a Sindhi, I am part of the Amal community, which is a subset of the Sindhi community. And he said, look, okay, I've had an okay time, but there are a lot of other Sindhi people who did not do so well when they came down for partition. They're more refugees. They need some help. So what he said is that I'm going to set up the Shahani Trust, and I'm going to work with other people in my Sindhi community to start setting up infrastructure to help these Sindhis progress. So therefore, the first generation, and this is actually interesting because when you look, and I've seen reflected with other Asian families with the patriarch, is that very often in the 1950s, there's a more socialist mindset, right? What can we do for our community? So therefore, by the way, that's not my grandfather, that's just a bunch of other Sindhis, this is a stock photo. But the thing is that they said, okay, look, let us set up colleges, let's set up hospitals, let's set up low-cost housing, which was actually what the refugees needed. And they said, but we're going to limit it to only our Sindhi community. Now, what is interesting is that when you look at other communities affected by partition, they actually were worse off. There were people starving. But the patriarch said, no, I'm going to help my sub-community. So when you talk about the first generation, or the first question about failure, is that who decides success and failure? So from a very neutral lens point, you say, look, you actually only helped your community, but you failed all these other ones who needed more help. However, the decision is that the patriarch said, this is my money, I'm going to decide where it goes. So that's the first generation. Let's move to the second generation. Now, some of you guys may recognize this gentleman here, Dhirubhai Ambani. Unfortunately, I'm not his son, but it's an example of what happened when the foundation went to my father and his brother. Now, those were the slightly more capitalist years of India, like the 1980s, 1990s. My father and his brother said, look, we've got this foundation that's been passed on by our father, but we actually want to spend more of our efforts making money. So they grew the family business. So they said, okay, look, we had a commodities business and a few other businesses that we were running. And they said, look, let's focus all our attention there. But we have a foundation. What do? They said, no, we're not going to give the foundation for someone else to manage. It's our foundation. We do not want to outsource the management of the foundation to someone else. Again, if you look at the 80s and 90s for a lot of Asian families, the family controlled a lot of things. You had a bunch of flunkies, but it's really the family, no matter how effective or interested they were running the organization. So what happened in terms of the second generation, the foundation was there. We had a pool of capital, but what happened was more like, where did the money go? Okay, there's an aunt who's got some orphans she wants to help. Okay, let's give her a check. Or there's like, let's say, a friend of a friend who said, okay, you know, I've got this thing I want you to help, can you give me a check? So it's more like, let's give a check, let's not ask what happened to the money, as long as we feel good about it. Oh, of course, let's give some money to the local temple because, of course, they need money. So the thing is that it is more like you have a pool of capital. The management was not concerned as to how the money was utilized. It's more like, okay, we got it, we have to do something because it's a duty, but it's more like it's not really a key component of our giving. So the second question really asks, and especially when you look at multi-generation family offices, and it's also even true in, let's say, for-profit businesses, is that the patriarch starts with a certain mindset. The next generation may have different interests. So who decides if the next generation should take over that business or foundation, or should it go to professional management? Of course, in the 1980s and 90s, the concept of really getting high-quality professional management was not really there. So we move on to the third generation, the young guy here. Again, these are not my kids, these are just some of the students that we work with. So again, it goes back to the ideas that, and this is interesting when you look at organizations like AVPN or the concept of impact investment or venture philanthropy. When I took over the foundation, and of course I have my other day job where we run colleges and other institutions, I said, look, what can we do to make this foundation much more effective, right? The Shahani Trust. So we said, okay, look, instead of getting involved in multiple things, let's start refocusing ourselves into a certain theory of change. So my doctorate is in the area of student employability. And if I start talking about the whole theory behind it, I mean, the whole 1 hour goes. But the bottom line is, we said, is that we want to help blue-collar kids and agricultural kids get jobs in the white-collar world, because our theory of change was saying that if you get a kid from an agricultural family into a corporate job, you are really shifting the needle in terms of their income. So we said, let's focus on that. Let's start divesting ourselves of all the other things, and let's just focus on this thing. And of course, with easy measures, with easier way to measure and more focus on audit. Two things. For the first time ever, instead of using our own family funds, we said, let's start aligning with other funders, because the project that we have is way bigger than our personal family assets. So we said, for the first time ever, we're going to now start raising money from international funding partners and local funding partners who believe in the vision and are happy to see us do the work. The second thing also important is that the thing is that obviously I was probably the main fundraiser, but at some point with my for-profit business, I have to figure out where my attention goes. So the thing is that we now are getting professional management coming in to run the foundation. But when you look at a lot of family businesses, and especially in India, they say, look, we don't mind spending, let's say, $1 million to get a high-paid CEO to grow our family business because we know there's return on investment. But if I've got $10 million to invest, will I want to spend $1 billion on this highly talented CEO to make sure the investment and the implementation happens? Because I, as a family founder, believe that I want to make sure most of my money goes into project deployment. But then the problem is that you are not able to grow the foundation. So the third question really is that when should a family let go when it comes to giving and impact? Of course, it's easy to say that for profit, for not-for-profit, not so easy. So those are just the three questions I want to leave you guys with. I don't have answers, but I will pass on the working mic and the clicker to my co-panelist.
Thanks, Akhil. Interesting point that it's a question of who gets to draw the parameters around what you consider success or failure. And it's highly dependent. Yeah. Okay, let me pass on to Jennifer Chen. Jennifer is the Chief Executive of the Chen Yat-sen Family Foundation, which uses moonshot philanthropy to address early childhood literacy and vision correction. She led all Asia operations for the Clearly campaign, which shifted global public perception of vision correction, framing poor vision as a development issue as the golden thread to achieving the SDGs. The campaign led to the founding of the UN's Friends of Vision group in 2018 and the UN's unanimous Vision for Everyone resolution in 2021. Also, in response to the significant disruption of funding for Hong Kong NGOs as a result of both civil unrest and COVID, Jennifer led the launch of the 2020 #BridgeTheGapHK campaign, which provided unrestricted match funding that offered a vital lifeline to 25 charities across Hong Kong. Jennifer, tell me a little bit about the Vision campaign, and let's talk about your work and from that point of view, and then how the notion of failure or success plays into that.
I'd be delighted to. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Alliance and AVPN, for the opportunity, and great to be here with my co-panelists to talk about this very sexy topic, learning from failure in philanthropy. The Chen Yat-sen Family Foundation is based in Hong Kong. but we have operations that touch Hong Kong and China and throughout the world. And the global mandate is what I'm going to talk about today in terms of addressing our topic, learning from failure. And Andrew did talk about the vision portfolio, which is what I'm going to share with you. This slide highlights a little bit of what we're trying to address. Low vision, or those who don't have clear vision, is holding back the potential of approximately 2.2 billion people in the world. The global population right now is almost 8 billion, so that's 25% of the world that don't have access to clear vision. And what does that mean? You've got some icons on this slide in front of you. It affects education. It affects productivity. It doesn't give us gender equality. I think a lot of these terms we're all familiar with as the Sustainable Development Goals permeate so much of our discussion. But in terms of the everyday situation, you've got so many social issues that you're not able to participate in because of lack of vision. And as I look around the room, and even as my fellow panelists, how many of us need glasses to survive through the day, or have had contact lenses in, or perhaps some surgical solutions to give them laser vision? It is a real situation that us in the developed world take for granted, that we can actually get clear vision if we don't already have it. So our conversation now is how to address those who don't, and the developing world is definitely in need of an intervention. We are at the Asian Venture Philanthropy Conference, and venture philanthropy is the key of what connects us all in this conversation. So it only is fitting that we have a chart to illustrate this. And this is a little bit of a detailed chart, so I'll make it quite simple. And the tagline is privatizing failure and socializing success. So the premise is, from a philanthropic point of view, the philanthropist, in this case, my boss, our chairman, James Chen, is a private philanthropist who is willing to risk his own personal capital to bring this vision correction conversation and make it a reality in terms of bringing clear vision to everyone. So he's willing to put his own personal capital on the line. He's willing to let any of these initiatives fail, such that he can then bring the success when the protocols have been identified and socialize them and bring it to everyone, and hopefully have the public sector adopt that. There are three logos in the bottom of that chart: AdLens, Clearly, and Vision for a Nation. I'm going to address each of those in the following slides. This is a number of people, 5 people, who are in leadership positions in 2015 at the World Bank. If I could just ask you to have a look at these slides, and if you can find a commonality in each of these individuals. Andrew, you got the first.
You're all wearing glasses.
Thank you. So all of these 5 individuals wear glasses. We had a product that was created by AdLens. It's adjustable lens technology, which creates a situation where you have a pair of glasses, can be adjustable, such that if you are long or short-sighted, it can give you clearer vision. It's not a perfect solution, but it certainly was something that we wanted to introduce to the developing world. And we felt that the World Bank could help us with that. So we went to pitch to the World Bank. They said no. That was seen as a failure. So from that failure, how did we pivot? We went and started our own charities. So our chair, James Chen, founded Vision for a Nation. And this is the next slide. The nation that we selected was Rwanda in East Africa. It has a population of 12 million. And due to the unfortunate incidents in the 90s where there was a genocide event, it provided an opportunity because there was a reset in the country, a completely new government, and a new healthcare system. We were very fortunate to be able to partner with the Ministry of Health and create a situation where primary eye care was able to be delivered to the population of Rwanda within a period of 5 years by having, if you can see in the photos, primary primary health workers be able to do a simple vision test in the district health centres that had been established by the government, and be able to do a simple diagnostic situation where if you couldn't see, could that situation be fixed with glasses? In some cases, it was a simple prescription for eye drops because conjunctivitis is a big problem in Rwanda. And we were very, very pleased that through this partnership with the government that we were able to deliver primary eye care to the country of Rwanda within a short period of time. And I'd like to highlight in these photos, the gentleman in the red shirt is our chair and founder, and he is the true visionary of Vision for a Nation. Having succeeded in Rwanda, however, we thought, what next? How are we going to go to the next country and the next country and the next? That would take us a lifetime because we were very fortunate. I highlighted that Rwanda had gone through a reset in its government, but not every country has that ability to be flexible and work with an NGO such as ourselves. So we wanted to get to the solution fast. Vision for a Nation was a service provider at the bottom of the pyramid, on the ground delivering services. We wanted to be able to get to the top of the pyramid, to change policy, to be able to reach governments and decision makers so we could hopefully make this reality of clear vision for everyone much faster. So we decided the next way, having seen Vision for a Nation as a failure in terms of achieving our ambition for vision for everyone, to look at a solution which involved a campaign which we named Clearly. So, James funded a campaign which we worked with several agencies to really disrupt the thinking of the vision world. Clearly was able to reach governments by looking at social media, by the messaging, by reaching the hearts and the minds of people through the various campaigns and activations we were able to run. Without going into too much detail, the culmination of that was in 2019 in this event we called Zeitgeist. We were able to bring vision NGOs all in one space in the one place, where before there was a lot of fragmentation in the vision NGO sector. And we were able to really get everyone at the same table speaking the same language. We were able to look at government conversations. We lobbied at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which was held in London in 2018, and really able to unify the conversations, such that we formed the UN Friends of Vision group, which Andrew touched on in his introduction. And then that led to a very exciting situation last year where we were able to have a UN resolution passed in July of 2021, where the 193 member nations of the United Nations unanimously voted for Vision for Everyone by 2030, and having eye care as part of the universal healthcare conversation. So we see that this journey has been a series of failures, but we've been able to pivot. ADLANS wasn't able to convince the World Bank to use its glasses in terms of distribution to developing world. Vision for a Nation, while successful in Rwanda, wasn't going to be successful in every country fast enough. So we started Clearly. And then the Clearly campaign then led to the Vision for UN Friends of Vision group, which led to the resolution being passed. So thank you for your time, and that's my sharing for this morning.
Jennifer, that's a great story. Thanks for that. It strikes me it's as much a tale of persistence as anything else, really, as much as failure. So it's one step back, two steps forward. It's a sort of reminder that progress is not always kind of smooth. I've got a thought about working across sectors and racking up the risk of failure, but let's park that for now, and I'll move on to Sumit. Let me just do a quick introduction. As far as I can do a quick introduction. So welcome Sumit Joshi. Sumit's Global Director of the Laureate Foundation, which I think is based in Geneva, but works in Southeast Asia. Is that right, Sumit? Yeah. He's a social impact advisor committing to driving thought leadership and action on diverse socioeconomic issues. His career has spanned his own enterprise, working with the UN and consulting in the development sector. At Laureate, he leads the Foundation's vision to support sustainable initiatives on early childhood education and youth employment for vulnerable communities in Mongolia and Southeast Asia. Sumit, tell us about your work and how failure plays into it and what you've learned about about your work from failing, if you have.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon. Very pleased to be part of the panel, and thank you very much for joining in. And I'll start with the premise of what C.S. Lewis once said, that failures are the fingerpost to the road to success. Failures are the fingerpost to the road to success. So with this presentation, I'm going to present about Laurier Foundation, who we are, what we do, and how we have embedded a learning-oriented approach in our daily routines. Laurier Foundation, it's a family foundation established in 2013, and our mission is to enable positive and sustainable impact on the lives of children, youth, and their families from vulnerable communities. Our approach is, the foundation is built on systemic approach to be able to build sustainable models. Broadly, we have 3 dimensions of our work. We work on the 2 ends of the education spectrum. One is early childhood education, and the other one is youth employability. We also have a few projects in clean energy and water, and I'll speak about these themes in a bit. The second is the geography of our work. Southeast Asia has been our learning grounds for very long, where we run many projects on these themes. But in Mongolia, we are more committed and more focused towards developing country programs for a very long term. The third dimension is the financing models that we employ, and that is very important. Of course, we are a grant-making organization, but as an outcome-focused foundation, we also intend to really do impact investing, look into innovative ways of financing, and I'll give examples of these in a bit. But if I speak about our vision for Mongolia, our goal is that children and youth transition successfully in the critical years of their lives. And we have a very step-by-step approach towards accomplishing this goal. From the community surveys, from the landscape studies, from our own strategic priorities in Mongolia, and from the learnings from Southeast Asia. What we have done is to really shape our investments, learn from these countries, and really be a learning-focused organization. However, and sadly, the state of social investments in Mongolia is still nascent. However, most of us in this room do business with Mongolia. The cashmere sweater that you may own, the minerals that we consume, they might have come from Mongolia. But still, the social investments don't go to Mongolia. So I guess it is imperative for foundations like us to really build evidence of our work, to be able to catalyze, mobilize more funds to the country. Beyond our regular portfolio, our recent work has been to really explore new models of financing, to test pilots, and adopt an evidence-based approach. And this is the topic for the panel today as well. How do we learn from our failures? How do we learn from the evidence that we create? How do we then build upon the evidence to replicate the models? So last year, we launched a very innovative model of financing in Singapore, which in fact is the world's first social impact guarantee with YMCA. Happy to chat more about this to anyone who is interested. And as you can see, this is tied to the third dimension of our work of different models of financing. Secondly, we just concluded a youth employability report, and I'm carrying this report with me today. The idea of this report was to really build knowledge about the journey of youth from education to employment, the challenges they face, the interrelations among many actors that they interact with, and to learn about the gaps and opportunities that youth livelihoods can provide. Thirdly, our partner, One Sky in Vietnam, they collaborated with Harvard very recently to conduct an evaluation study for our program in Vietnam. Theirs is a training program for home-based care providers. And as a matter of fact, there is indeed a lack of evidence, indeed a lack of research for quality and affordable childcare. And most of the evidence that is available is based on high-income country settings. So this is, in fact, the first of its kind study in Asian industrial zones. The results are promising, and we now intend to have similar results in Mongolia as well with the government. In fact, in Vietnam, the work will now be adopted by the government, and that's the exact point I'm trying to highlight. If we are able to build evidence of our work, the ecosystem is able to adopt your work, and that's precisely the goal of any funder, perhaps. We anticipate very similar results with our new investment, very ambitious investment in Mongolia with the Asia Foundation. Theirs is a flagship program called Let's Read, which is to see how often parents read to their children who are aged 0 to 5. In fact, we just concluded a baseline study with the Asia Foundation to track how much do they study. Again, the results are exciting. Less than 10% of parents read to their kids every day. And when we looked into the results, the time was less than 10 minutes. Less than 10 minutes every day, and less than 10% parents. So again, the idea behind this study is to use data and evidence, to use this for monitoring, for course corrections, for adaptation during the course of the program. And finally, we believe that we cannot do it all by ourselves. We need more hands to join to become a force for good. We partnered with UBS Optimus Foundation recently for our grant, the ECE grant in Mongolia. With them, again, we are conducting a study with Innovations for Poverty Action to understand what has worked on ECE globally, so that we and other stakeholders as well are able to use this data and evidence to improve their own programs. So the study is going to be over by August, but at the very onset, I can emphasize the fact how much important is to really distinguish between the delivery mechanism of any program and the content of any intervention. At the same time, the context of every country is extremely important. Something might work in different country, but might not work in Southeast Asia or Mongolia. So the context is equally important. And lastly, and moving forward, we continue and we hope that we are able to improve the impact of our programs. We intend to continue to build evidence of our work. But more importantly, we believe in collectives. We believe in joint efforts. We want more funders to join in. We want to act as a catalyst for mobilizing funds to Mongolia. And happy to again speak more on this to whoever is interested on this topic. Thank you, everyone, for your patience throughout the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Amit. That's great. I like your phrase about failures being finger posts to success. In some ways, you're saying the same. It's generous persistence again, really, isn't it? But, let me move on to bring in Stefan Schäfers. Stefan is Executive Director of the King Baudouin Foundation in Belgium. He's also chair of Civitas, a philanthropic initiative for documentary democracy and solidarity in Europe, and the European Fund for the Balkans, and formerly the European Programme for Integration and Migration. He's a member of the governing board of the European Policy Centre, a Brussels-based think tank, and the European Foundation Centre, as it formerly was, now known as Philae. Stefan, I started with a quote about sort of if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. And I think it's actually your predecessor, Luc Théat, who said that, actually. Tell me about because obviously there is this relationship between risk, failure and risk, and is there a balance and where does it lie?
Yeah. I think it's one of the most important issues that we are facing, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. First, some words about our foundation. So, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to Europe, those that are online with us here. Great to have you. The Clean Baudouin Foundation is Belgium's largest public benefit foundation. We are a private foundation. We are not a royal foundation, which many people believe we are. We just carry the name in honor of late King Baudouin. We are an independent foundation, and we are quite complex to explain, so the elevator pitch doesn't fly with us. I always need a bit more time to explain who we are, because we are a hybrid foundation. On the one hand, we are a classical private foundation with our own endowment and our own programs. But then, over the last 20 years, we have developed towards an umbrella foundation, which is kind of a national community foundation, which hosts 1,200 donor-advised funds, kind of donor-advised funds. I just use the US terms. That means that basically that donors, individuals, families, or corporates come to us and develop with us their philanthropic journey. And then it is the foundation that receives funds from those people and implements the wishes of the philanthropists and the donors from the very early, from strategizing till reporting. That means that a lot of people are actually involved in our foundation, because each of these funds is run by an independent steering committee, which takes a decision on what happens to the fund within the remedies of the objectives given by the philanthropist. And therefore we have, for example, more than 4,000 people that are volunteers and based and working in these steering committees, management committees of these funds. We gave last year about 133 million euros, and you can imagine that if you are a foundation like this, you have to work in many different fields, because donors and philanthropists coming from all walks of life and have very different interests. Things that matter to them are very often different, and therefore we have clustered all these funds in these programs that you can see here on climate, environment, heritage, education, social engagement, and Europe and international, which is geographical. And we have a big program which is on health, which is funnily not on that slide, I'm just realizing. We're also internationally very active, because many of our philanthropists and donors that work through us, they are interested in international work, in giving internationally, and for that we are having just created recently a network of our entities of the King Baudouin Foundation in Brussels, in New York, in Montreal, together with Give to Asia and their entities here in Asia, in Hong Kong and in Asia, in Australia. And we call it Myriad, which is an alliance for borderless giving. Having said that, coming to the topic, failure and learning. In an organization like ours, which is working with so many different people on so many different topics, which is not very focused like the previous speakers, who were very often focused on one topic or having a very clear strategy, we are working on so many different topics that it is very difficult to avoid failure. And even if you're working on one topic, you also have failure. So, but I think it makes it even more complex. So our assumption is failure cannot be avoided. So how can we turn this into something positive? And there, the first element is, of course, learning. And that's what the session is about. As long as we learn from our failure, that's a good thing. And we need to foster really the knowledge management. But we also mentioned that already, culture in organization and individuals, and the fear of being shamed and embarrassed for failure, which we are all raised to succeed, to have, to show our best. And if you have to admit failure in front of others, nobody likes that. So there is a personal, human aspect, there is a cultural aspect, and we try to overcome that with something which we call our Best Failure Award. And I don't think we invented it, because you mentioned already our previous CEO. He also said always, I better copy a good idea than develop my own bad one. So most probably it comes from somewhere else, but I don't know from where. So somebody has done that already, most probably. And we just copied it. And we did it, and I must say it was a big failure at the beginning. Why? Because we told people, this is a voluntary participation, just share your failure. And at our annual reception, which is our, others have Christmas parties, we have annual receptions, New Year's reception, where there are drinks and food, and it's very nice. We're going to give the award to somebody who basically has the best failure. And you can imagine, people didn't really know how to take this. How embarrassing is this going to be in front of all my colleagues to receive this award for having done, the biggest failure. Basically, people came with something which we see, I think, very often in this learning and failure environment. They came with something which was not really a failure. There was a failure on the way, but in the end they succeeded. Or it was such a minor failure that they thought, well, I mean, that really was not that relevant. So I think a lot of people try to, it's like in an interview, when you do job interviews, very often people ask, what's your biggest weakness? And you always come up with something which is not really a weakness, but it sounds like one, but then you turn it around into a strength. And it's pretty much the same psychological issue here that we're having. So we got really not good outcomes of this at the first edition. So we changed it in the second round, and don't worry about that table, nobody can read it, on top it's in Dutch. It just shows you basically how we did it. So we asked everybody, every program, that they had to nominate one failure of their team. So it was less of an individual thing, it was already a team thing. That makes it easier. And everybody had to describe the project, what the failure was, and what the learning was out of it. And in this case here, it was something that was done in my team. We tried to create a community foundation in an area where we are very active in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in one area called Katanga. And we did it a bit top-down. We thought this is a brilliant idea. There are so many community foundations all over the world. There was an interest. We tested that. We went really very often there to talk to the important stakeholders and to try to convince that this is a great thing. And they all said, yes, yes, great thing. We chose some people that were supposed to lead it. We didn't really check enough on them. And we figured out that they wouldn't represent the entire community, but just a part of it. So others would not really fully trust them. And hence, after 2 years of work and trying and trying and trying, we came to the conclusion this doesn't fly. Because of our own approach of choosing people which we should have looked broader, of really a community foundation only works when it comes bottom up, not top down. And so we stopped it. And this was an example of failure. I could give you many more, but it's just one. So one element, as I mentioned, is failure and learning. As long as that goes well together, I think we are good. But there is something more for foundations, and that is we should also accept failure, because if we don't take risks, we will, you don't fail. So you have to fail if you're willing as a foundation to take risks. And basically it's an indicator, and not to fail is an indicator that you didn't take enough risks. And as a foundation, and that's our perspective, we have no owners. We are an independent foundation with a very wide board. So there's no family, there is no person. We have no shareholders. We have no voters. We're not policymakers. So basically, if we can't fail, who else can in this world? So we need to take risks, calculated risks, not crazy ones, but calculated risks, and we have to accept it doesn't work. And in this philosophy, I think it is most important that we really see failure as kind of a reward for taking risks. Of course, it is most important that we learn from it again, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If you take a risk and if you try out things and it doesn't work, you're really obliged to learn from this. And just a little side note this goes a bit off the topic, but I think it's important because I hear a lot, especially here also, on impact. Impact is always the absolute measure and the absolute objective of most people here. So success is how much impact did you have? That means success. And as good as that is, I think it is also the enemy of risk-taking. Because if you force people to show their impact constantly, people will just not follow the learning and the failing philosophy that I just mentioned. And we as foundation, we called ourselves already in the early 2000s an impact-driven foundation. And I think that was wrong. As important as it is to have impact, it is equally important to set incentives that people take risks and fail. I repeat my story here. So a redefinition of success is important for us, and so we stopped calling ourselves very much impact-driven foundation. We try really to broaden that definition of what is success for us, and that is taking risks, to fail, and to learn from it. And of course, if we still receive impact with other and achieve impact, it is great and we should do so. So it's not an either or, it's an and. Thank you.
Stefan, thanks. Great story. I love the kind of irony of the best failure award itself being a failure. That's lots of good stuff to unpick there. We'll come back to the notion of risk and failure in a while. But let's move on to my next question, which is kind of, you talked about sort of the management leading. You had to present a failure from a department. Let me ask to all of you, if you want to become a sort of learning organization, which we've talked about, a cultural change in the organization, who's that? What's the most important element in becoming a sort of failure that accepts, talking about risk, is tolerant of risk? Is it the board? Is it the management? Does it come from the beneficiaries, your kind of grantees?
Well, I think it's, of course, we like to think that as the board, we are all knowing, all seeing, and everything happens because of us. But no. The thing is that ultimately, it's a lot of the culture actually goes from ground up, especially in learning organizations. But I think the key thing, the one thing that management can do is to say the thing, there's actually the two types of what you call failure or learning, right? And it's likened to a ship. One is the sort of failure that will sink the ship, and one's the sort of failure that will steer the ship. So I think that as a organization, if you're able to allow your people to make mistakes or try new things, and you know that the risk is not going to sink your ship. So for example, like take an example of an investment bank, I will not give my trader, let's say, the right to actually trade on $2 billion, right? But I don't mind giving the trader, let's say, a small amount of money to play with. So same way with our organization, there will be people who will try new experiments. They may work, may not work, but we know that we will learn from them. More important, make sure you don't chop someone's head off, or metaphorically, of course, and make sure that basically you are accepting, and don't use the word failure. Use learning as an alternative term, and I think that gives the people a sense of comfort and willingness. Okay, yes, I will try to learn something new today, and that, I think, overall affects the organization, benefits us all.
In terms of organization, I think that the way that we, in keeping with the slides that I shared, we really looked at how the money would be worked in the smartest way. I think that the venture philanthropy, going back to that and the chart that I shared, we wanted to make sure that that private capital was really used in the best way, taking the risk, but making sure the risk was smart and measuring the level of failure that we were willing to accept and getting to a point where we felt, okay, this is an acceptable level of success, or is this going to fail so badly that we can't pivot to make this into a success? So in keeping with what you were saying, Stefan, we probably, in the examples I shared, never fully failed. We were able to succeed in enough of a situation when we felt, okay, if we can continue this way, if we try to go from nation to nation, we're going to invest a lot of capital. We may succeed, it may take a long time, but we won't be able to get to our measure of success, which was to create that vision for everyone conversation. So I think in terms of the answer to that question, it's really, we were using the measure of capital, money, as the way of bringing some discipline to the conversation.
It's interesting. I'll come to the point on risk again in some time maybe, because that depends on the point of view of the funder or the implementation organization. But to answer your question, I think three things are very important here. First is definitely the mindset and the role of the board, the investment committee is very critical. A bold leadership and a fundamental cultural shift is required to be able to accept that, acknowledge and maybe normalize that, yes, you have failed. And mitigating the risk is not a failure. Failure is when you have done all the activities, all the actions are done, and then there is no result. And then you have to wait for the course correction and wait for the next cycle. The second point, and I'm building up on your point, which is about learning, but I would extend the topic to the communication between the grantee and the funder and the grantee. We often talk about holding each other accountable for outcomes, but do we hold each other accountable for learning what you have learned over the course of the grant? And we always care about, and when we say we, in fact, even at Lorraine Foundation, we were establishing our monitoring and evaluation practice. And that's when I learned from a different foundation, very established foundation, that what is our learning approach? What are those strategic learning questions that we have to find? What are those learning guiding questions on research and evaluations? And that's why we are doing so many studies. I'm not sure how many funders do have a dedicated budget for data and collecting data and building evidence. So embedding learning in your daily routines is very important. And third, I think a flexible funding model is also important. Within this COVID context, it is even more important. Unrestricted grant for nonprofits to be able to build resilience in the long term. So to be able to think about innovative ways, that's what I was talking about, to be able to think about innovative ways and then sometimes opt for flexible funding models. Yeah.
Maybe just in addition to that, I think it's, when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, we need, of course, also good planning at the beginning. We need to have our assumptions, we need to have our context right, we need to have the evidence right. And for that, when we have strategic and more long-term projects, we have a wonderful template where all these questions are asked and everybody is forced to fill that in properly. And then we have an interesting thing. We have a choice to be made between choose your KPIs and choose your learning outcomes. And if I look at all these templates that I'm seeing in the management team passing by, 90% of the people do learning outcomes and they try to avoid KPIs, which I think is an interesting observation, I find, first of all. Maybe it's the easier way to deal, because KPIs, to define them is sometimes very difficult, especially when we talk about system change and not just about a service delivery or things like that. But it is I think also important to see that what is more important to us again. What is the real success of a project? And there, I believe it's good that people actually put learning outcomes first. As a foundation, we really try to do this in all the big projects, but we also, we have to be honest, we have a lot of small-scale projects. As we have all these donors and different topics, we cannot engage all the time in these kind of extensive processes of planning and then monitoring and evaluating. It is sometimes generosity, it's one-offs, where I think we have to be also humble and modest as an organization, that not everything is measurable, not everything is plannable perfectly, but still it makes sense to do these kind of supports for organizations. And another final point maybe, and I think it's really important for us working with grantees that whenever we have to adapt something because we failed and we have to adapt the project and the plan, which we hope we always do, but we hope, that we also do this with our grantees, that we give them the flexibility and the freedom to come to us, and also to encourage them to come to us whenever they have the feeling something didn't go as planned. And there I see sometimes really grantees being scared of saying, oh, it doesn't really work what we have proposed 2 years ago. We are seeing that we have to adapt it. Is it okay? And we are saying, of course it's okay. I mean, you should, and you should tell us this right away, because there's no problem to change our contract, or if you have to use money differently, because we see so many projects that are going over a long period. It is impossible to plan everything on day one. And with a lot of grant contracts I see from fellow colleagues, also from other foundations, they're so strict about the spending. It has to happen, and then if there's 10% spent differently, they have to ask for, is it okay that we change our money and we change the money flow and the spending in the project? I think we should show much more flexibility towards our grantees, that they can really do what they think is best, because we, sitting in a office somewhere in Brussels, we cannot judge. They are the experts, and they're the ones we have to trust on these kind of things. So encourage them and give them the opportunity to change whenever they think there is a failure in the process and they need to adapt to it. I think that's really crucial.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Sumit, over lunch, I think you mentioned something about the sort of different perceptions of failure, and it can vary. It can be what looks like a failure for a beneficiary might not be a failure for a grant maker. Let me ask a naive question. Does it matter if the funder thinks a program has failed as long as the beneficiary doesn't? Why should we worry about that?
Yeah, the common ground is definitely the beneficiary. But when I talk about failure, the point of view really matters. For the funder, it could be a direct loss of social ROI, but for an implementation organization, it means much more perhaps. It sometimes creates that perception of the inability to deliver projects on the ground. To all the parties, it could be a loss of credibility and expertise and relevance on the topic. But again, the common ground is the beneficiary. For them, it doesn't matter. And there, when a social investment fails, what happens is it disrupts disrupts people's lives, and also many a times erodes the trusts of the community. So in that context, my first point is that funders have to be really more ambitious to be able to explore pilots, test different models, and to be able to know what works or alternatively what can work. But the irony is, and I think it might not be a stretch to say, that funders generally are risk averse. In fact, we must appreciate the fact that social investments in the first place are a risky investment. They ought to be the most risky investments, but, and I would like to take the audience opinion on this, are they really dealt this way? Because the social investments deal with a range of stakeholders. They deal with the intricate socio-economic fabric of a community. So it is important that they are dealt with a risky investment. So let's be more risky about this. Let's be more ambitious about this. When I say how do you deal with failure is important, and that's my second point, that we at L'Orient Foundation, we think that it is important to see failures as contributors to knowledge. Many a times failures, of course, do have unintended outcomes, but they also have positive outcomes. So what do you learn from those positive outcomes is also important. And failures also test your own internal capability, the capability of the systems to test new approaches. So that's very important, and what we have done really is to not look at the solutions approach. What we do is to look into apprentice ourselves with the problem-first approach. Many times, again, organizations and we individuals, everyone, consultants, we jump into conclusions too soon, but then the need assessment, the landscape studies, the researches that we do, the data that we collect, that helps in really replicating the work which is successful and really mitigating the risks of failures.
Thanks, Sumit. Jennifer, I want to come to you because you made the point with the vision campaign that it's kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back sometimes. Does the risk of failure, the challenges sort of ratchet up when you're working across sectors? What effect does that have on the sort of the chances of failure?
There was actually a subtext to this. Vision for a Nation succeeded in Rwanda, and we actually had tried to move it to a next nation, and we selected Ghana. And for the interest of keeping to time, I didn't go into this in my introductory slide. So we actually started Vision for a Nation in Ghana, and we got some funding. We were actually approved for funding from DFID in the UK and USAID from the US. And very delighted that we were able to meet the very stringent agency regulations to qualify for that funding. But when the pandemic hit in 2020, again, going back to funding and the high, ridiculously high KPIs that are required, the reporting that goes with those KPIs, it was impossible to deliver and therefore impossible to take that funding to bring Vision for a Nation in Ghana to fruition. So we were very fortunate that the Clearly campaign had already been started, and in parallel with the closing of Rwanda, the beginning of Ghana, we were able to avoid complete failure if that was the route. And you're very right in saying that it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 3 or 4 steps back. And it is a dance. And it is important, and I think going back to this private capital from philanthropists, that it is flexible, touching on points that were raised, and unrestricted funding, flexible funding. You need to be able to change direction and be very nimble. I mean, COVID has taught us all, no one planned for the extreme disruption that COVID brought to all of us. We all had to adapt, and we had to adapt quickly. And I think that the power of the philanthropic dollar was really manifested in this case. And we were able to move funds very quickly to situations, government too, but I think that the philanthropist dollar was also very much appreciated. And I think this dance that we do, we have to adapt, we have to be able to read the signs, predict what can happen, and if it doesn't happen as according to our prediction, be able to adjust quickly and therefore avoid a bigger failure that perhaps might manifest itself.
So you kind of learn piecemeal as you go along rather than have a sort of blocked out vision of how you meet challenges, how you work with a certain sector.
I think you have to. I mean, we don't have a rule book or a playbook. I think in terms of the philanthropic scene, all of this is uncharted waters. I think that we have governments who traditionally have taken risks in terms of providing universal health care, if we go down that route, but they overlooked vision. It wasn't seen as urgent enough. No one's dying. No one's actually having a life-threatening illness if you can't see very well. But we're going to a practicality situation is if you can't have clear vision, you actually aren't actually having a full life. And if a simple solution such as glasses, which by the way was invented 700 years ago, why wouldn't this simple solution that so many of us benefit from in the developed world, why isn't this able to be distributed and made available to those in the developing world to make their lives better and to bring that social inclusion that universal healthcare should be able to deliver?
Great, thanks, Jen. Let's take a question from the audience. There's a kind of intriguing one here. Has your failure ever cost you a damaged relationship with your partner, stakeholder? If it does, how do you mend it? Akhil, can I bring you in on this one? The hot one.
Thank you very much. All right. So I think this is something that some of us as funders tend to be guilty of, that we think that we know better than the beneficiary themselves what's good for them, right? And especially when you look at the age of the scale of education and employability. Hey, you know, we got the PhDs, we got the analysts, we understand the landscape of India, so therefore we know what the intervention is, right? So let's actually talk about what actually happened. So as I mentioned earlier, we are helping to get kids from rural families to get jobs in the corporate world. So when we started in Bombay, and we were very successful, and we did quite well. We said, okay, let's move to next door and in a place near Baroda, which was, we had some rural families around that. And of course, this was COVID, so we were doing stuff online, and we were like saying happy with our masks and, you know, online. And we were looking and saying that, okay, look, in Bombay, the kids are going through our program, and we have a 90% success rate, and they're getting jobs and blah, blah. But in Baroda, we're getting only a 50% success rate, if at all, and slowly and steadily, even though we're trying to mobilize students, there are less and less students coming along. And we were sitting in Bombay and saying, what do you think's wrong? I mean, so then people said, oh, you know, there's a cultural difference. You know, the families in Gujarat are much more conservative. They don't want their kids to go from the villages to the cities. They think that, okay, they don't want to go beyond their farming. So basically, we put the blame on the families for not understanding the great gift that we were giving them. So then we said, okay, look, obviously there may be something that's wrong. So after COVID lockdown got over, we actually went to the villages, and we spoke to some of the villagers and the panchayat, you know, the village elders, and asked, okay, like, what's wrong? Why do you not want your kids to sort of grow and actually get a lot more money than they would have got otherwise as farmers? They said, look, the problem is not that we don't like what you're doing, right? But in Bombay, if you want to get a kid a job in a bank or the service industry, the kid has to speak English very well. They have to do very good at selling and have a certain personality. In Baroda, they said the problem is that not only do we not speak English, half the reason why these kids are dropping out is because we can't even understand the language of what you're putting on your app, or even the conversation of the teachers. So he said, okay, good. Then should we then increase the teaching of English? But he said, no. Before we jump into that, let's actually talk to the recruiters, the people that the kids are going to, and figure out, do you actually want English-speaking kids? And the recruiter said, no. We're in Gujarat. Majority of people speak Gujarati. We actually want a kid who can sell very well in Gujarati, not in English. So therefore, what we did is that we shifted the focus away from English and said, let's start creating content in Gujarati to make them sell more. And that worked for us. But the point is that instead of us having a top-down approach and saying, okay, we know what's better for you, we actually said, let's talk to the partners. And we almost ruined the relationship, as to go back to your question, is that what is it that, what could damage, how to mend it. So we said, okay, let's actually understand what the beneficiary wants, what's their environment, and let's sort of change it. So if you want to go back to a more, a larger framework and say, okay, what will actually change? So I've been married for 30 years to the same wonderful lady, and we said, so when people ask me, what's the success, what's the secret of success in your marriage of 30 years where you still, still love each other mostly? I said that basically there are three things, right? One is, make sure you communicate often. Secondly, make sure when you make a mistake, you say you're sorry. And the third thing, very important, is to make visible actions to improve. Of course, the ratio of me being wrong with my wife is 100:1, but that's a different thing. But the point is, when you're talking to your partners or talking to your funders, have an open dialogue. Be aware that you will make mistakes in some way or the other. Do make sure that you admit when a mistake happens, and do make an effort to improve. I think that's really open communication. Just keep doing that.
Great. Thanks, Akhil, for that insight into your domestic life. Stefan, did you want to comment on that one? I saw you making notes there.
Yeah. I think there are different types of failure also, and we have to see, this question refers to failures in general. So I think there's a distinction to be made between a failure where the intended outcome or impact has not been achieved. And I think we all know how that is, and everybody has had that moment. And then there is a failure which really damaged reputation of organizations because it really went wrong, had a negative press or whatever. I must admit, in the latter category, I don't have an example, and I'm very happy that I don't have one, because I think that's really, really difficult to fix. In the other point, though, when you have, you invested a lot of money and you ask partners to join and to pool funds, and well, you have to admit at the end of the project, it didn't really work out. And we are doing a lot of policy influencing projects in Europe, especially, where together with other foundations we try to change policies on citizen participation or on energy transition and this kind of projects. And you never know what comes out of it. And everybody knows this from the beginning. So I think what is really important is honest communication. Don't trick your partners into something where they don't really know what the risks are. And in the risk in this case is very often, you invest and nothing comes out. I think actually in the majority of these projects, the policies are not changed. But when they are changed once in a while, you have a huge success. And I think this is always something you have to communicate well. Moreover, I prefer really collaborations than somebody gives us money and we do the work. Because in a collaboration with other foundations especially, if everybody sits on the table and takes the decision together, you also mitigate the relationship damages that can happen, the risk of damages of the relationship, because they were there when the decision was taken, and they knew what the risks were when they took the decision. And so when we fail together, so to say. I think that makes life much easier, and I would recommend people to do that. And we do a lot of pooled funds in Europe, and that is, I think, always successful, because nobody is really disappointed that somebody else took a wrong decision and they were not really involved, because they're always involved and sitting on the same table and deciding together.
Great, thanks. So honest and open communications, and I guess the important thing is no recriminations on both sides as well. Sumit, Jen, anything to add to this? Just say to all panelists. So do you want to weigh in on this, or should we move on?
Just quickly, I think that damaged relationships it's a consequence of breaking barriers. I think that we have had in the different NGOs that we partnered with or fund, situations where you have to have tough conversations. I think that the failures that we've touched on, each of us have had to have really harsh realities. And so damaged relationship, yes, absolutely. I think that it is an unfortunate byproduct of pushing the envelope. And then in philanthropy, we're doing work that others don't do. The reason why there are beneficiaries is because the system doesn't provide those beneficiaries with what they need, whether it be food, shelter, glasses, there is a gap. And so I think in terms of, again, providing that private sector expertise and trying to bring that professionalism to the conversation, it is a difficult situation, but communication is key. Absolutely agree with that. And having realistic parameters, I think, is the other thing. I think sometimes when we try to do too much too soon and look at the resources that are available, we've just got to really be smart about how we allocate and be realistic about what we can expect.
I guess we have spoken about the examples, and we have many. What I would like to provide is how we have dealt with this. The examples of what we did afterwards. For example, I wouldn't categorize a project in terms of this is successful, this is a failure, because within a project, what will you do with the fantastic, top-notch, successful strategy if that fails on the ground? So there could be different elements of success and failures within a project, but what is important as a funder is to, if they want to really make an orbit-shifting impact, then they have to take risks. So within that context, two things that we have done, and there's the third thing, which is, of course, the learning, but two things that we have done that really have worked is, one, scenario planning. It might sound a little jargon, business jargon, but that's a fantastic tool to really deal with uncertainties. And uncertainties can come in many forms. For example, within the social investments, what we have seen is there are many external factors that can combine in many complicated ways, intricate ways, and then they create uncertain futures. So this happened with us as well when the community engagements completely stopped. And 1 year of our work in Mongolia, and that's the example, when we were working, the first phase was about a pilot. The second phase in 2021 and 2022 was about scaling up. But in 2020, COVID happened. There was a sudden panic. And let me admit, we just did not know for many months what to do next. And that was the time for many months when we were clueless. One thing that we did rightly was to really acknowledge this as a failure. When you acknowledge that, the space for open communication, that opens up. So within that, what we did was to plan for scenarios, and for implementation organization, it is even more important to boost the confidence of the funders, as well as for them to be able to see the short-term certainties, the long-term visibilities. Because when you look into the scenarios of, let's say, COVID, the magnitude of case numbers, the rollout of vaccination, the status of lockdowns, and that's when you are able to plan for these, and that's when you become really agile and adaptable to changing circumstances. That's one. Second is, again, and I'm a strong proponent of this, to be able to take pivots. We love our core models and core delivery models so much that we shy away from taking pivots. And what I encourage is, and what we have done is to really think about, again, if the scenarios demand to change the delivery model, to change the approach, then be it. Just let's do that. It can integrate, it can mean to integrate technology to your daily routines. It could mean to partner with the local entities, perhaps. It could mean, and I might sound controversial now, it could mean that you scale down certain aspects of the program. And just to do the damage control, you might have to accelerate something else. You know, when I say scale down, you might have to scale down community engagement, but then prioritize, let's say, content creation, let's say digital content. There were many examples of many organizations who could not progress during COVID because they could not understand how to utilize the digital being. But many flourished because they could quickly adapt. So how do you adapt is important. You know, we took time. We really took time. 1 year of failed resources, time, of course, money. But then we learned scenario planning is important. And now what we have done is, with every grant, we make sure that the proposal comes with scenario planning. Today it is COVID. Tomorrow, I don't know what can happen. You know, so please plan for the scenarios. Please be open to taking pivots. And third, which is a no-brainer, is be open to learn, like you said, open to communicate and normalize failures.
Thanks, that's great. And your mention of COVID eases into the next sort of the next audience question very neatly. Thank you. As we move into a world that's, well, a post-COVID world, hopefully, along with other global issues, how do these issues affect how we assess risk and failure moving forward? Stefan, I'm going to use my prerogative as chair just to pick on you brutally.
Great question. As a foundation, we always try to be neutral and not to be seen in a certain political corner, especially with the model that we have that's really important to us. But if I look at today's world, and as a European, we have our little issues right now, and big ones. We have never had a war in 60, 70 years of this magnitude in Europe. We see the radical parties popping up everywhere. We see really societal threatening issues. And I think it's not only in Europe, it's in the US, and I'm not too sure about Asia, but I could imagine that also you have your issues here. So the world is, in my view, not in a very good shape. And I think as a foundation, it will be more and more difficult to keep this neutral stand, which means we will have to go into projects to defend the societies in which we believe in much more bold action, which means we will take much higher risks than we did in the past, which means we will fail. And we potentially also fail in what I mentioned before, the second category of failure, which will damage the name of the foundation, because we will be at a certain moment seen by groups as whatever we are in that moment, and we will be attacked. And I fear there's no way out unless our society is taking a turn to the positive, which right now I don't see where they will come from. So to defend the values we believe in and to defend the societies in which we live, we have to be bold.
That's funny, the conference sessions keep circling around the same sort of topics, isn't it, with these boldness and ambition. They keep coming back to that. Jen, anything to add to Stefan's remarks?
Well, COVID has really rocked us all. And I think that in the way that our foundation has looked at it, we've been very embracing of the opportunities to look at technology. And I think that when we look at risk and failure and delivery of solutions, we have to look at how we can be able to pivot. As you said, scenario analysis. If we can't have an event in person, do we have the ability to quickly change the delivery platform to make it a online version? So I think the thing is, I think from our point of view, our flexibility has really been heightened. But we also are very much aware of how the skill set of the people that we have in our teams is very much valued. I think that when we switch to having in-person meetings or in-person delivery of solutions and had to do everything online, the fact that we had the strong relationships with our colleagues, with our beneficiaries, it really was a very, very important part of sustainability. But in terms of how we assess risk and failure going forward, I think that we are, a little bit more tolerant of how COVID has made us look from a different lens and to really be able to assess things in a more, softer light, is that possible? And just being accepting of the successes that we can achieve within a limiting world that we live in now.
Thanks, Jen. Akhil, I'm just going to come to you on this as we're getting short of time. We've spent most of the time talking about our own the failures within our own organizations and how we deal with them. But there's also another piece to this of how we learn from other people's failures so we don't repeat their mistakes. How do we get better at that, and what are the sort of fora for doing that?
Well, come for conferences where people talk about their failures, one thing, but more importantly, the thing is that I think it's really a fact, and again, putting a plug for AVPN and other organizations, the thing is that all of us have a lot of experience and a lot of, let's say, failures and things that we're happy about, things we're not happy about. The problem is, and again, it goes back to the whole idea of communication, is that whenever you meet somebody in an environment like this, or even when you're interacting, most of the time you want to look good. It's always your first date. That, hey, I'm brilliant, I'm the best, I know my stuff, and then the other person said, no, I can't be stupid in front of that person, let me also show that I'm brilliant. So you have all these titans of philanthropy both talking to each other and hiding their internal failures or experiences. I think the same way that the awareness of impact investment or impact philanthropy is now becoming a common language to us. Now, for example, when you do philanthropy, you do measure impact. I think if we start having that conversation that failure is a learning experience. So therefore, for example, when I talk to somebody and say, okay, what do you do? It's not just, hey, we do all this great stuff, but also, by the way, this is what we also did and this is what we learned from. I think if we ourselves are willing to actually share openly, online or offline, or when we meet people, that itself will facilitate an environment of learning from each other and enabling all of us to sort of develop best practices for ourselves and for each other. Communication again.
So we're talking about a shift in mentality really among funders. It's not with these godlike people who've got this money to give away. We're actually learning. We're on the journey with you, as it were.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. We're just got about 8 minutes to go. So I want to come back to each of you for just a kind of closing reflection, if I can. Just sort of key takeaways. Has this changed anything you think about learning from failure?
How do I learn from failure? Well, I think the learn Sumit and Dr. A. I think that we all are very aware of how much good that we can bring to the conversation. And the failures that we all are able to tolerate, I think that it just makes us stronger, it makes us smarter, but it also makes us more determined to succeed. And I think that in the case of our own philanthropic journey that I shared with you today, we were very, very much focused on the end goal. We're still not there, having achieved the UN resolution. It's a legitimization of what we're trying to do. It's an endorsement from the United Nations and those who voted for that resolution, but there's still a heck of a lot of work to do. So the Sustainable Development Goals, 2030 is the deadline. Are we going to get there? I think there's questions about that we can take into another discussion. But I think learning from failure means that we have to be keeping an eye on the prize. We, in our case, want to partner with the public sector, getting governments involved in the solution, such that, again, going back to the mantra that our chairman has come up with, we want to privatize the failure, take it on the philanthropic balance sheet, and then socialize the success so that everyone can benefit from the they've made. Thanks.
I think we often hold on to the assumption that learning from failure is straightforward, but I don't agree. I think unless we systematically analyze what happened, why it happened, how it happened, most of the opportunities for emergent failures, they are missed. So it's very important to understand, and that's my key takeaway, that learning should happen by design. It should not happen by default. You should plan for the learnings from our failures, and that has what has helped us as well. That the shift in mindset, that investments in knowledge building and data collection today will go a long way to really mitigate the chances of failures and risks later on. No? So as a tangible step, and I can really suggest to have a dedicated budget for data collection, knowledge building, and please disseminate information. And of course, when I say learning from failure should happen by design, we should also have the guiding questions throughout the course of interventions, throughout the strategy phase, throughout the research phase, so that we plan for learning. That's it. Thank you.
Stefan.
I think there's still a long way to go when it comes to this issue. But the good thing is that we are talking about it, about failures and learning from it, and much more open than we did in the past. It was always a little side issue, but nobody really wanted to talk too much about it. And now I think we are in a new phase where this is becoming also a bit en vogue. I think in many sessions this has been discussed, this topic, and that's good to see. But of course, every time we have to also see what are the restrictions of all this and the limits, because we cannot invest endless means into really evaluating everything, seeing what went wrong, how we can improve. It is simply not possible because it costs a lot of money and time of people, which very few don't have. So we have to find also a manageable way of dealing with this issue, which is ambitious but doable. What I like here in Asia, which is something I think you're much more data-driven than we are in Europe. Sometimes I have the feeling that in Europe we are still, we start from a wishful thinking, and that's the first base of our project, and we don't look too much at the data around it. We don't dig deep enough, and if we do, we find only the data that basically confirms our wishful thinking. We don't look at different kind of data, and here you are, and I've met so many people in the last days which are so much further in using digital tools to really come up with big data very often on issues that are of relevance for us as funders, and that is really something, chapeau, which I think is a great evolution, and I hope we can learn much more from you guys in Europe, also in Africa, and wherever we are active. In general, as a philanthropist, I think we should be very humble still about our role. Sometimes we do as if we change all the world all the time. I think we don't. We have all our niches, we have all our small means in the end of the day, looking at the big challenges of the world, and keeping that humbleness is something extremely important also for the future, not to disappoint also in the future by making big statements and then little follows. That is also kind of a failure.
So I'm just going to take off on what Stefan said. I'm actually reminded of an orphanage that my family has been supporting for the last 20 years. And in the earlier days, in my dad's time, grandfather's time, we used to just give them a donation every year, and like once a year go there and meet the kids and have a good time and things like that, and all, everything was hunky-dory. Then of course, because we are engineer MBA types, we said, okay, last couple of years, let's start measuring impact. Let's see what happens. So we went to the orphanage and say, look, can you actually account for all the money we've given you? What's happening? Where are you using it properly? Are you making sure the kids have a balanced diet and they have food and clothes? And then, and the orphan owners, the person running it said, why are you asking us all these tough questions suddenly? I mean, all this time things were happy. I mean, you got slightly kid, and suddenly you're asking us all these tough questions. We said, no, we got to check it out because impact measurement. I mean, I'm being exaggerating. But we did have an expert going in and actually just having a look at the orphanage. And honestly, at the end of, let's say, I think around a month's period, what we discovered was startling. The orphanage was trying the best they could within the constraints that they had. So what happened, basically, we said is that, okay, look, let's actually take a step back, right? We said, okay, look, let's not look at the world of philanthropy as three discrete entities. Here's a funder. The funder will measure how well the implementation partner does. The implementation partner has to then check how the beneficiaries are doing. They are not three discrete elements. So what we told the orphanage owner, he said, okay, look, yes, fine, no problem, let's trust you. What can we do, instead of just giving you money, to help you enhance your operations? Let's hold hands together, and we have a problem of helping these kids. Let's work together. So it goes back to, again, I keep on repeating the same communication phrase, but I think maybe that's one thing that works. The idea is that let's stop looking at measurement only as discrete entities. Let's trust each other. Yes, verify, but do trust. And let's actually work together to solve the problem. All the funders, the impact, the service providers, and the beneficiaries. I think that's really the best thing to do. And then probably less failure.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks to all four of you for kind of bracing discussion. Thanks for reminding us of the need for both humility and boldness, and the fact that progress is not a sort of steady ascent. It's actually sort of littered with sort of stumbles and dead ends as we go along. But as long as you go through the right door in the end, that's the key. Thanks to all four, Stefan Scherfers, Sumit Joshi, Jennifer Chen, Akhil Shahani. Thanks to you for being here. Thanks to you for watching on live stream. We'd look pretty silly if we'd been sitting here on our own. That's it. Thank you.
What did I write?